Hey guys, welcome back to a new video on cleaning gaming PCs. Today will be episode 2. Today what we're going to do, we're going to be cleaning and detailing this, stripping it down to bare bones, cleaning all the parts and making sure it's looking brand new. And for the upgrades, we'll be upgrading the power supply and we'll be adding a GPU, which this one never came with a GPU. So yeah, stay tuned. We'll get into it in more detail throughout the episode. Now that the case is deassembled, all the parts are out, we're going to be blowing off all the dust, then we're going to get into the deep cleaning process, then we move in to the graphics card, which does need deep cleaning and does need deassembly. So we're going to start with the PC, everything that came with the PC, then we move on to the GPU. So yeah, stay tuned to the next clip. Now that we've completed majority of the case, we move all the parts on the case, we're going to be moving on to the motherboard strip down. Starting off the RAM sticks. And then moving on to the CPU, which will be cleaning off the thermal paste. Now that the CPU is out of the socket, closing off the motherboard. Now we'll be moving on to the CPU cooler. Oh my days, as you can see, looks like the CPU has not been being cooled that well. Now we're onto the graphics card. So that was attached by 2 screws. As you can see, these ones have levers. Okay, they were attached by double-sided tape. That's why it was struggling. So it wasn't the fans that were connected to the heatsink. But moving on to the fan assembly right here. We're moving on to the front panel. We're moving the power button. This one we don't need to move it, yeah. So we're moving on to the next clip where we're going to be explaining the next step. Now that all the parts have been deassembled, starting with the case, we put it all to bare bones, including the front panel, which all the front panel parts are around here somewhere. And then we moved on to the motherboard, which is all stripped down also, CPU cooler and the graphics card, other than the power supply, which this one may do off camera. And yeah, let's get right into the next scene where we start blowing off the dust. Bringing in the GPU itself, using the vacuum to blow off all the dust in all the areas we can, as much as possible. Then we moved on to the fan shroud of the GPU. Didn't need much to blow off, it's just in the fan area. Using the brush going everywhere with the blower, making sure every square inch is covered. Bringing in the CPU heatsink, as you can see, the layer of dust. We start from the blowing from the other side, bringing in the CPU fan, doing the exact same thing we do with the CPU heatsink, going between every blade as much as possible. So bringing in the motherboard, bringing the brush, making sure it's touching every square inch of the board. The CD drive, pretty basic, just blow off as much as you can. Bringing in the front panel, just going through every area, preparing it for the washing process. Bring in the GPU heatsink, doing the same thing we did with the CPU heatsink. Moving on to the hard disk drive, we did the same we did to the CD drive, the case fan, the front boards, the Wi-Fi card, and the RAM sticks. We just went over them with the brush, blowing off the surface dust, also including the SSD. Then we moved on to GPU fan. We did the same thing as the previous step. We did the same thing as the other fan, blowing off in between the fins, preparing for the deep clean process. Bringing the case itself, blowing all of the surface dust. Now that we came back from the blowing process, we blow off as much as we can with the vacuum. Now we're going to be moving on to the deep cleaning process. Now that we're back, we moved on to the mold. The isopropyl alcohol and the soft bristle toothpaste, spraying at the appropriate, making sure I scrubbed every area as much as possible. Then the IO unit, which is just pretty much scrub, wiping off the residue. The CPU, just removing the remainder of the thermal paste. The SSD, using the rag, using that just to wipe. Same thing to all the front ports, we just scrubbed the areas that needed to be scrubbed, and then we just wiped it down. Case fan, we just went through every square inch, then we moved on to the blades, making sure there's nothing left over. The CPU hinge sink, we got the same wet rag just to remove the remainder residue of that. For the next few items, the Wi-Fi card, the CPU fan, GPU fan shroud, the hard drive, the CD drive, and finally the RAM stick. Each of them we either wiped them down or scrubbed them down with the toothbrush. Moving on to the GPU itself, we sprayed isopropyl alcohol in the areas and then started scrubbing it down with the toothbrush we used in previous clips. Then we moved on to the crusty thermal paste, wiped it off with a rag, and brought a stick type of tool to get in the small areas so we don't damage the capacitors. Same thing we did to the front, we applied to the back. So these guys right here, we're going to be washing them in water, which will be done off camera. And once all the deep cleaning process is done, once I finish washing these, we will be back to the next clip. Now that we came back from all the deep cleaning process after washing the case and blowing off all the dust and giving it a deep clean, now we'll be moving on to reassembling the PC. We're going to start with the graphics card, bring in all the appropriate parts. What we're going to start with is assembling the heatsink, the fan shroud, and the fan. So we're going to move this. So we're going to be attaching the fans first. So we started by attaching the fans to the fan shroud, each fan needing 4 screws, which is a total of 8 screws, which attaches in the fan shroud. Now that's complete, we're going to be attaching the heatsink to the fan shroud. Now moving on to the GPU itself. Then we started with the thermal paste, spraying it evenly with a spatula, making sure we cover all the appropriate areas as much as possible. After doing so, we brought in the attached heatsink, fan shroud, and the fan, bringing the fan cable, connecting it to the board of the GPU. Then finally attaching the last 4 screws that attaches the heatsink to the fan shroud. 2 other screws, the small screws just for the heat spreaders. And move on to the motherboard. Now that the motherboard is here, we're going to be opening this lever to bring in the CPU. The CPU is an i5 3570, and I did realize when I started cleaning it there was bent pins. It seems like it hasn't been impacting the PC whatsoever. So yeah, we're just going to keep it that way. We're not going to fix it or anything unless it will cause issues down the line, then we'll come back to it. So slotting it in. Now we're going to move on to the RAM sticks, which is a kit of HyperX DDR3 2x4GB, which equals to 8GB of RAM, which is not ideal in 2025, but this is what the viewer wanted and I already had in the system. Always want to put it in slots 1 and 4, depending obviously on the motherboard. Bring in the CPU cooler and assemble that. Now that the CPU cooler is ready, we're going to bring back the motherboard and we will go from there. Now we need to attach the cooler onto the motherboard, but first of all, before we do that, we need thermal paste. Now we do have to put in the CPU cooler. So now that the motherboard is ready, we'll be moving on to the next part. We'll be moving on to the case. We will start by assembling the front panel. So we brought in the port for the front panel of the case, which consists of the power button, the reset button, and 2 USB buttons. Now that we've done the basic assembly of the case, we're going to start moving on to the front panel. Firstly, starting with by clicking it back in place, where we see the spring in between the front panel and the button itself. Then we started bending back the front panel pieces, which was slightly bent. Just straighten as much as possible, not too much to the point where it breaks. Now that the front panel is ready, we're going to be moving on to assembling the whole front side of the case. Now that we completed the front panel, as you can see, we're going to be moving on to unboxing the power supply and putting it in there. So this is the power supply. It's an Ego 500 watt, which is 80 plus certified. So it's a really good budget supply, which costed around 50 bucks on AliExpress, which the actual cost will be shown on the screen. For a budget power supply, this looks really good. Really good looking power supply. So right now we're going to be going back to the case, installing this power supply, and we see how it looks. Screwing the 4 screws that attach the power supply to the case. Then flipping the case on the bottom, there's a bracket for the power supply, which is attached by a bracket and 2 screws. Then bringing the motherboard in, screwing down the motherboard. After completing the screw down, we started with connecting the 24 pin to the motherboard, the C4 pin connector. And the back fan that's located at the back of the case, connecting the fan cable of the fan case, and then connecting all the non-vital cables, which consists of the USB 3.0, power button, reset button, etc. And pretty much right now we're just tidying up the cable and locating them to the appropriate locations. Bringing in the hard drive, sliding into the hard drive bay, lining the screw up, and then bringing in this plastic part that acts like a screw to hold the hard drive into place. Bringing in the graphics card itself, breaking off the metal pieces on the PCIe section of the case in order for the graphics card to slide in. Then we decided to unscrew the graphics card and the Wi-Fi card to tuck in the CPU power cable behind the two, because the back panel really doesn't have any sort of cable management area, which we gotta deal with what we have. Then finally we connected the GPU power, which is an 8-pin connector. Also connecting the drive to the SATA power and the SATA cable to the motherboard, making sure it's receiving power and signaling to the motherboard. Finally, to finish off the case, we brought in the back panel, which we secured the back panel with 2 screws. Okay, we did run into an issue where it was here, everything plugged in, and it would not show any power. So I did assume that the power supply was faulty, since it's more like a budget one. And I took out some cables and realized that the USB 3.0 is the one that's shortening the whole power supply, which wasn't allowing anything to receive power. As you can see, it's working now. We'll be putting it back here to test if it works onto the monitor. So we somewhat kind of repaired the issue, but not really. We figured out the issue though, but the motherboard that was in here previously that we cleansed wasn't working with the graphics card. I assumed the PCIe slot was the problem. I had to play around with troubleshooting a lot, and it was an annoying process, that's why I didn't record it, and it was a boring process. So I just got replacement parts, replaced it for the viewer, and yeah, I think that's good to go right now. You can see Windows here. I'm just going to upgrade the drives and everything, and we'll move from there. So if it loads into Windows, we will be ending the video hopefully. Yeah, we completed the build. Looks good, clean, detailed, and it's upgraded with a new CPU, which is an i5 7400 compared to before, as you saw, was an i5 3570, and we got an 8GB stick of DDR4 RAM running at 2400 MHz, which is, you know, a decent upgrade, more newer, and you can really upgrade if you wanted to. Like the CPU, you could upgrade it to an i7 later down the line, get 16GB of RAM, and it'll be a perfect budget gaming PC. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Please like, subscribe, comment down below what you believe, what you think, or any opinions you have. I'll be reading every single comment as much as possible. Have a great day, guys. Peace.